The dusty streets of Abilene, Kansas, had grown quiet since the circus packed up and left 3 days ago. But Margaret O'Sullivan hadn't left with them. She stood at the edge of town, clutching her 6-month-old son Thomas against her chest. Her once brilliant red and gold costume now faded and torn at the seams. The sequins that had once caught the light under the big top now hung by threads, some missing entirely, leaving small holes in the fabric like tiny wounds. Her pointed shoes, designed for walking tightropes, were cracked and dusty from walking on hard earth instead of canvas-covered platforms. "You can't stay here, ma'am," Sheriff Coleman had told her that morning, his voice not unkind but firm. "Town's got rules about vagrants." Margaret had looked down at Thomas, his innocent blue eyes reflecting the morning sun. "My husband died performing for your people," she'd whispered. "Francois fell from the high wire right here in your town. Doesn't that count for something?" The sheriff had removed his hat, running weathered fingers through graying hair. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly I am. But circus folks, well, you move on. That's what you do." But where could she go? The Belfonte brothers' circus had offered their sympathies and $20, barely enough for a week's lodging. They'd suggested she find work in a town somewhere, maybe as a seamstress. But who would hire a woman in a tattered circus costume carrying a baby? Now, as the sun climbed higher over the Kansas plains, Margaret walked west along the dusty trail that led toward the Colorado Territory. Thomas slept fitfully against her shoulder, occasionally fussing from the heat and her nervous energy. She'd been walking for 2 hours when she heard the sound of approaching horses. A wagon creaked up behind her, driven by a weathered farmer and his wife. "You need a ride, miss," the woman called out, her voice cautious. Margaret turned, hope flickering in her chest. The woman's expression shifted when she saw the circus costume and the baby. "Oh," the farmer's wife said, her tone cooling. "You're one of them circus people." "My husband died," Margaret said quickly. "I just need to get to the next town. I can pay." The farmer leaned over to speak quietly to his wife, but Margaret caught the words, "Trouble follows them types," and "probably diseased." "Sorry, miss," the farmer called out. "Wagon's full." Margaret could see their nearly empty wagon bed, but she said nothing as they drove past, leaving her in a cloud of dust. Thomas began to cry, his small voice lost in the vastness of the prairie. She adjusted her grip on him and kept walking. The sun was merciless, and she could feel perspiration making the cheap fabric of her costume stick to her skin. By evening, she'd have to find shelter somewhere. By tomorrow, she'd need food. As she crested a small hill, Margaret paused to look back at Abilene, now just a dark smudge on the horizon. Francois was buried there in the town cemetery, under a simple wooden cross that read, "Circus Performer, 1848-1878. She'd wanted to stay near him, but the living couldn't survive on sentiment. "We'll be all right, Thomas," she whispered, though her voice cracked with uncertainty. "Mama will figure something out." A hawk circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the lonely sound of wind moving through tall grass. The trail ahead stretched endlessly toward mountains she couldn't yet see, and Margaret O'Sullivan, widow of the flying Francois Beaumont, walked on into the gathering dusk of the American frontier. 3 days later, Margaret's costume hung in tatters that barely qualified as decent clothing. The red fabric had faded to a dull rust color, and the gold trim had mostly fallen away, leaving bare threads. Her dancing shoes had given out completely. She walked now in Francois's old performance boots, stuffed with cloth to make them fit her smaller feet. She'd made it to Dodge City, that infamous cattle town where cowboys and gamblers mixed with honest settlers trying to build lives on the frontier. The smell of cattle and dust filled the air, along with the sounds of piano music and rough laughter spilling from the saloons. Thomas had grown fussier, crying more often. Margaret feared he was getting sick, but she had no money for a doctor. She'd managed to buy a little milk and bread with the last of her circus money, but that was gone now. Standing outside McGillicuddy's general store, she bounced Thomas gently, trying to soothe his whimpering. Her reflection in the store window showed a woman she barely recognized, thin, sun-weathered, desperate. The circus performer, who had once danced on horseback, now looked like any other destitute drifter. "Please, sir," she said to the next customer entering the store, a well-dressed businessman, "could you spare anything for my baby? Just a few cents for milk." The man looked her up and down with obvious disgust. "Get a job like decent folk," he muttered, pushing past her. An older woman emerged from the store and paused, studying Margaret with sharp but not unkind eyes. "You're that circus widow," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, I am. Heard about you from folks passing through. Your husband was the one fell from the wire?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The woman, Mrs. Henderson, as she introduced herself, owned the boarding house on Front Street. "I might have some work," she said. "Washing, mending, cleaning." "You can do those things?" "Yes, ma'am, anything. Pays not much. Room and board, mostly, and a little extra. But you'd have to get proper clothes. Can't have guests seeing someone dressed like—" She gestured at Margaret's costume. It was the first real hope Margaret had felt in days. "I'll work hard, Mrs. Henderson. You won't regret it." But when they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson's husband took one look at Margaret and Thomas and shook his head firmly. "No babies," he said flatly. "Crying keeps the guests awake. Bad for business." "But George—" Mrs. Henderson started. "No babies, Emma. You know the rules." Margaret felt her heart sink. "Please, I'll keep him quiet. He's usually a good baby. He's just tired and—" "Rules are rules," George Henderson said, not meeting her eyes. "Find somewhere for the child, then come back." Mrs. Henderson looked embarrassed. "There's an orphanage in Kansas City," she said quietly. "Good Christian people. They'd take care of him proper." Margaret pulled Thomas closer to her chest, feeling panic rise in her throat. "He's not an orphan. He has a mother." "A mother who can't provide for him," George Henderson said bluntly. "Sometimes the kindest thing—" "No." The word came out sharper than Margaret intended. Several people on the street turned to look. "No," she said again more quietly. "I won't give up my son." Mrs. Henderson pressed $2 into Margaret's hand. "I'm sorry, dear. I truly am." Margaret found herself back on Front Street as evening approached, with nowhere to go and night falling fast. Dodge City came alive after dark, but it came alive with the kind of men who might see a desperate woman alone as an opportunity. She needed to get out of town. She bought what provisions she could with Mrs. Henderson's $2, a small jar of milk for Thomas, some hardtack biscuits, and a worn shawl to replace her torn circus cape. As she prepared to leave town, the storekeeper called after her. "You heading west, lady?" "Yes." "Be careful out there. Comanche have been raiding lately. Army's got patrols out, but they can't be everywhere." Margaret nodded her thanks and stepped out into the darkening street. Comanche raiders, as if she didn't have enough to worry about. But as she walked toward the western edge of town, Thomas finally quiet against her shoulder, Margaret realized something had hardened inside her over these past few days. The world might show her no mercy, but she would show her son what strength looked like. Whatever lay ahead on that dark trail, she would face it. Behind her, Dodge City's lights twinkled like fallen stars. Ahead lay only darkness and the vast, dangerous frontier. The fourth night found Margaret camped beside a small creek, 20 miles west of Dodge City. She'd fashioned a shelter from her torn circus cape and some fallen branches, nothing that would keep out serious weather, but enough to block the wind. Thomas slept fitfully beside her, wrapped in the shawl she'd bought. She'd run out of milk that morning. The hardtack was nearly gone too. Tomorrow she'd have to find food somehow, berries maybe, or edible roots. Francois had told her stories of performers who'd survived hard times by living off the land, but those had seemed like adventures then, not desperate necessities. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grassland. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Margaret had heard other sounds too, horses moving at night, though she'd seen no riders. The storekeeper's warnings about Comanche raiders kept echoing in her mind. She was trying to nurse Thomas with what little milk she had left when she heard it. The soft sound of a horse moving through grass. Not the random wandering of a wild animal, but the deliberate movement of a ridden horse. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She carefully gathered Thomas against her chest and peered out from behind her makeshift shelter. A single rider sat motionless on a ridge about 50 yards away, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Even at this distance, she could see he wasn't wearing the uniform of a cavalry soldier or the clothes of a settler. His posture, the way he held himself, the feathers in his hair, everything about him spoke of the Comanche warriors the storekeeper had warned her about. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. Margaret hardly dared breathe. Thomas, as if sensing the danger, remained quiet against her shoulder. Then the rider began moving down the ridge toward her camp. Margaret's mind raced. She could run, but where? She was on foot with a baby and he was mounted. She could hide, but her white costume would show up clearly in the moonlight. She could scream, but there was no one for miles to hear. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She stood up. The rider stopped his horse about 20 feet away. In the moonlight, Margaret could see he was a young man, perhaps in his 20s, with war paint still streaking his face in dark lines. He carried a rifle across his saddle and wore the traditional clothes of a Comanche warrior: buckskin leggings, breechcloth, and a bone and bead chest plate that caught the moonlight. They stared at each other across the small space that separated them. Margaret could hear her own heart beating, could feel Thomas's small body warm against her chest. The warrior's eyes moved from her face to the baby, then to her torn costume and makeshift shelter. She saw something shift in his expression, not the look of a raider evaluating prey, but something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. Slowly, deliberately, he dismounted his horse. Margaret took an involuntary step backward, but there was nowhere to go. The creek was behind her, and the rider was between her and any possible escape route. But instead of advancing toward her, the warrior walked to where she could see him clearly in the moonlight. He was younger than she'd first thought, with intelligent dark eyes and a face that, despite the war paint, seemed more curious than threatening. He spoke to her in Comanche, his voice low and questioning. When she didn't respond, he tried again, this time mixing in a few words of broken English. Woman. Alone. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Baby. Sick. She looked down at Thomas, who had begun to whimper softly. Hungry, she managed to say. He's hungry. The warrior nodded as if he understood. He walked back to his horse and removed something from a leather bag tied to his saddle. When he returned, he held out a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was dried meat and what looked like a type of bread made from corn and berries. For baby, mother, he said in careful English. Margaret stared at the food, then at the warrior. Nothing about this encounter matched what she'd been told to expect. Where was the violence, the savagery that people spoke of in whispers? Why? She asked. The warrior looked at Thomas again, and Margaret caught something in his expression, a sadness, perhaps, or a memory. When he looked back at her, his eyes seemed older than his years. I have had sister, he said slowly. Baby sister, also hungry, also gone. In that moment, Margaret understood. This wasn't about race or territory or the conflicts that raged across the frontier. This was about something much more fundamental, the universal language of loss, of protecting the vulnerable, of recognizing suffering in another human being. Slowly, she reached out and accepted the food. Thank you, the warrior nodded. Then, in a gesture that would puzzle Margaret for years to come, he walked to where his rifle leaned against a nearby rock, picked it up, and deliberately laid it on the ground beside her shelter. Not as a threat, but as a promise. A guardian's weapon, placed where it could protect rather than menace. He spoke again in Comanche, words she couldn't understand but whose meaning seemed clear. You are under my protection." Then he remounted his horse and rode back toward the ridge, leaving Margaret alone with her son, a bundle of food, and the knowledge that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. Margaret woke before dawn to find the rifle still lying beside her shelter, proof that the previous night hadn't been a dream. Thomas was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, his small belly finally full from the cornbread she'd softened with creek water. The dried meat was unlike anything she'd tasted, tough but flavorful, clearly prepared to last long journeys. As she chewed a small piece, Margaret found herself thinking about the young warrior's words. "I have had sister." That single word, had, carried the weight of the entire frontier conflict. How many families on both sides had lost children to disease, violence, starvation? How many mothers had held hungry babies while the world around them burned? As the sun rose, painting the grassland gold and orange, Margaret heard horses approaching again. This time there were several riders, and they weren't trying to move quietly. A cavalry patrol crested the ridge, 5 soldiers in blue uniforms riding hard toward her camp. The lieutenant leading them had his rifle ready, and his eyes swept the area for signs of trouble. "Ma'am!" he called out as they approached. "Are you hurt?" Margaret stood holding Thomas. "No, we're fine." The soldiers dismounted, and Margaret quickly kicked some dirt over the rifle beside her shelter, covering it from view. Something told her these men wouldn't understand the gift she'd been given. "Lieutenant Morrison, Fort Dodge," the leader introduced himself. He was a young man, probably not much older than the Comanche warrior, with serious blue eyes and a carefully groomed mustache. "We're tracking a Comanche war party that raided a ranch 2 days ago. You see anything?" Margaret hesitated. She thought of the young warrior's sad eyes when he spoke of his sister, of the food he'd given her son, of the rifle placed as a guardian rather than a weapon. "I saw a rider last night," she said carefully, "but he didn't bother us." "Comanche?" Lieutenant Morrison's voice sharpened. I think so, yes." "Which direction did he go?" Margaret pointed southeast, away from the direction the warrior had actually taken. "That way, I think. It was dark." Lieutenant Morrison nodded to his men, and they began preparing to ride. But the sergeant, an older man with grey in his beard, studied Margaret more carefully. "Ma'am, what are you doing out here alone? This is dangerous country." So Margaret told them her story, the circus, Francois's death, her search for work and shelter. She didn't mention Mrs. Henderson's offer or her refusal to give up Thomas. Something about these soldiers, for all their official concern, felt less trustworthy than the Comanche warrior who'd shared his food. "There's a settlement about a day's ride west," Lieutenant Morrison said when she finished. "Mostly farmers, some ranchers. They might have work for someone willing to labor." "What kind of settlement?" "Germans, mostly. Came out here about 5 years ago. They're good people, religious, hard-working, but they're particular about who they let in." The sergeant was still studying Margaret's torn costume. "Ma'am, you might want to present yourself differently. Frontier folks can be suspicious of circus people." After the soldiers rode away, Margaret sat by the creek and really looked at herself for the first time in days. The circus costume that had once been her pride was now barely recognizable as clothing. The bright colors had faded to muddy browns and grays. The sequins were mostly gone, and the fabric was torn in so many places that it was held together more by determination than thread. She had Francois's spare shirt in her small bundle of belongings. A simple white cotton shirt that, while too large, was clean and decent. Using water from the creek, she washed as best she could, then changed out of the costume that had become both her identity and her prison. When she picked up the costume to bundle it away, something crinkled in the inner pocket. A letter, written in Francois's careful script that she'd forgotten was there. He'd written it before their last performance, as he always did before difficult acts, a letter to be opened only if something happened to him. "My beloved Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you must be very frightened, but you are stronger than you know. You survived growing up in the orphanage. You learned to dance on a tightrope 30 feet in the air. You made people believe in magic and wonder and beauty, even when their lives offered them little of those things. Our son will need that strength now. Teach him that the world is bigger than any one place, any one people. Teach him that kindness can come from unexpected sources, and that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do when you're afraid. I have left you nothing but debts and dreams, but dreams are sometimes the most valuable inheritance of all. All my love. Francois Margaret carefully folded the letter and placed it in her bundle. Then she picked up the rifle the Comanche warrior had left, checked that it was loaded, and slung it across her shoulder. It was heavy, but she was learning that survival sometimes required carrying heavy things. As she gathered Thomas and prepared to continue west, Margaret thought about the strange education she was receiving. From the circus, she'd learned that spectacle and wonder could lift people's spirits. From the harsh reactions in Abilene and Dodge City, she'd learned that the world could be cruel to those who were different or desperate. From Mrs. Henderson, she'd learned that even kindness came with conditions. And from a young Comanche warrior, she'd learned that humanity could transcend the boundaries that people drew between themselves and others. The German settlement was still a day away, and she didn't know what she'd find there. But she was no longer the same terrified widow who'd left Abilene a week ago. She was a woman who'd been gifted food by an enemy and protection by a stranger. She was a mother who'd chosen her child over comfort and security. Most importantly, she was a survivor. As Margaret O'Sullivan walked west across the Kansas prairie, Thomas sleeping peacefully against her shoulder and a Comanche rifle on her back, she carried with her all the lessons the frontier had taught her. That strength could be quiet, that enemies could become protectors, and that sometimes the most profound moments of understanding happened between people who shared no common language except the recognition of shared humanity. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and somewhere ahead lay whatever came next in her American story. Epilogue. Seeds in foreign soil. 5 years later, Friedenstall Settlement, Kansas, spring, 1883. Margaret stood in the doorway of the one-room schoolhouse, watching 5-year-old Thomas chase butterflies across the prairie grass with the other children. His laughter carried on the warm spring breeze, mixing with the German voices of his playmates and the distant sound of hammers from the new church being built on the hill. Friedenstall, Valley of Peace, had lived up to its name, though the peace hadn't come easily. When Margaret had first arrived at the German settlement that day in 1878, dusty and exhausted, with a rifle slung across her back, the colonists had been suspicious. These were people who had fled the political upheavals of Europe, seeking stability and religious freedom. A circus widow with a mysterious weapon and a baby was exactly the kind of complication they'd hoped to avoid. But Heinrich Weber, the settlement's unofficial leader, was a practical man. His wife Anna had died the previous winter, leaving him with 4 young children and a farm that demanded more hands than he possessed. When Margaret demonstrated that she could cook, mend clothes, tend sick animals, and wasn't afraid of hard work, practicality won out over suspicion. The arrangement had begun simply. Margaret would help manage Heinrich's household in exchange for room and board. Thomas would grow up alongside Heinrich's children, Karl, Greta, Wilhelm, and little Emma. It wasn't love, but it was survival with dignity. Over time, something deeper had developed. Heinrich proved to be a gentleman, scarred by his own losses, but committed to building something good in this harsh land. He never pressed Margaret about her past, or demanded more than she was ready to give. When Thomas called him Papa Heinrich, the German farmer's eyes would fill with tears he was too proud to shed. The rifle, that gift from the Comanche warrior, had remained Margaret's secret for 2 years. She'd kept it hidden in the barn, cleaned and oiled, but never mentioned, until the day the Petersons' homestead was attacked by cattle rustlers. When the emergency bell rang and the settlement's men grabbed their weapons to ride to their neighbor's aid, Margaret had quietly retrieved the rifle and joined them. Her marksmanship, learned from Francois during their travels with the circus, proved better than most of the farmers. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Heinrich had asked that night as they rode home. "From my husband," she'd replied. It wasn't entirely a lie. And the rifle? Margaret had paused, thinking of that moonlit night by the creek, of a young warrior's sad eyes, and his gift of food to a hungry baby. Someone who understood what it meant to protect children gave it to me. Heinrich had accepted this explanation without further questions. The German settlers had learned not to probe too deeply into each other's pasts. Everyone had reasons for starting over. Now, watching Thomas play, Margaret marveled at how much had changed. The boy spoke German as fluently as English, helped tend Heinrich's cattle, and could already read simple words in both languages. He was growing up to be exactly what Francois had hoped, a child who understood that the world was bigger than any one people or place. "Mrs. Weber." Margaret turned to find Sarah Mitchell, the settlement's new schoolteacher, approaching with a concerned expression. The young woman had arrived from Boston 6 months ago, full of educational theories and Eastern refinement. "Yes, Miss Mitchell? I wanted to speak with you about Thomas. He's been telling the other children quite remarkable stories about his father being a circus performer and his mother crossing the prairie alone with wild Indians." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She and Heinrich had married 2 years ago, a practical arrangement that had slowly deepened into genuine affection and partnership. Thomas had been too young to remember the details of their early journey, or so she'd thought. What exactly has he been saying? Well, he claims his real father could fly through the air, and that a Comanche warrior gave his mother a magic rifle. Sarah Mitchell's tone suggested she found these stories both amusing and troubling. "The other children are beginning to believe such nonsense. I think it's important for Thomas to understand the difference between fantasy and reality." Margaret looked back at her son, still chasing butterflies with innocent joy. In a few years, he would be old enough to ask harder questions about his origins. She would need to decide how much truth a child could carry. "Miss Mitchell," she said carefully, "sometimes the most important truths sound like stories to people who weren't there." That evening, as Margaret tucked Thomas into the bed he shared with Wilhelm in the loft above the main room, he looked up at her with Francois's bright blue eyes. "Mama, Miss Mitchell says my stories aren't true." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing his dark hair. "What do you think, Thomas?" I think I remember Papa Heinrich before Papa Heinrich. And I think I remember being very hungry, and I think someone helped us who wasn't supposed to help us." The clarity of his memory surprised her. "What else do you remember?" "I remember you crying a lot." "But you never let me cry hungry." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "No, sweet boy, I never did." "Mama, were we different before we came here?" "We were the same people, Thomas. We just needed to find where we belonged. And this is where we belong." Margaret looked around the simple but comfortable room. Through the window she could see the lights of other houses scattered across the valley, families like theirs, trying to build something good and lasting. Heinrich was downstairs, mending harness by lamplight. In the morning, there would be chores and lessons and the ordinary miracles of daily life. "Yes," she said, "this is where we belong now." After Thomas fell asleep, Margaret walked outside into the cool evening air. Heinrich joined her on the porch, as had become their custom. "Sarah Mitchell spoke to you about the boy's stories?" he asked. "How did you know?" "She spoke to me as well. She's concerned about his wild imagination." Margaret was quiet for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, crickets, distant cattle, the whisper of wind through grass. "Heinrich, do you ever wonder about my life before I came here?" Her husband, for that's what he truly was now, in heart as well as law, was quiet for a long time. "I know you were married to a performer who died. I know you traveled far with a baby, facing dangers I cannot imagine. I know someone taught you to shoot better than most men, and I know you've never told me everything about that journey. Does it matter? Only if it matters to you." Margaret reached over and took his hand, rough and strong from years of farm work. "I want Thomas to know where he came from. All of it. The circus, the journey, the kindness of strangers. But I also want him to know where he's going. And where is that? Forward. Always forward." The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would affect the rest of Thomas's life. She went to the barn and retrieved the Comanche rifle, cleaning it carefully before carrying it to the schoolhouse. "Miss Mitchell," she said, "I'd like to tell the children a story about the history of our territory, about how sometimes, in the hardest times, people who are supposed to be enemies can recognize their shared humanity." And so, for the first time in 5 years, Margaret told the complete story of her journey west. She spoke of Francoise's death, of the long walk across Kansas, of hunger and desperation, and the cruelty of people who should have shown kindness. And she told them about a young Comanche warrior who saw a hungry baby and a desperate mother, and chose compassion over conflict. When she finished, the schoolroom was silent. Even Sarah Mitchell, for all her Eastern education, seemed moved by the simple truth of what she'd heard. "Is that really your rifle, Mrs. Weber?" asked Karl, Heinrich's eldest son. "It is. Did the Indian really give it to you to protect Thomas?" Margaret thought of that moonlit night, of a young man's sadness when he spoke of his lost sister, of the profound understanding that had passed between them without a common language. "Yes," she said, "he did." Thomas raised his small hand. "Mama, what happened to the warrior?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope he found his way home safely. I hope he found peace." That night, Margaret placed the rifle above the fireplace mantel, where it would remain for the rest of her life, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that the world was full of unexpected grace, that enemies could become protectors, and that sometimes the most profound gifts came from the most unlikely sources. Years later, when Thomas Weber graduated from the State University and became a teacher himself, he would tell his own students about the circus performer who could fly, the mother who walked across dangerous territory to keep her child safe, and the Comanche warrior who laid down his rifle beside a stranger because he understood that protecting children was more important than any conflict between peoples. And in those telling and retellings, the story became what Francois had always said the best stories should be: a bridge between different worlds, a reminder that beneath all the surface differences, people shared the same hopes, fears, and capacity for unexpected kindness. The circus widow had found her home at last, not by forgetting where she came from, but by understanding that home was something you built, day by day, with the people who chose to stand beside you when the storms came. In the end, that was the greatest performance of all.